Welcome to Bio Insights, where we explore cutting edge technology in biotechnology, movement science, and human performance. I'm your host, Marcelo Aller. Today's guest is Coach Carl Valle, a performance specialist and technologist who has been coaching since the 1990s. I've known Carl for quite some time. We've worked together. We've always been in touch. He's worked with athletes from the high school level to the Olympic level in sprints and hurdles. Uh, Carl is led sports, he's a sought after sports technologist that has served as a director of innovation. He's contributed extensively to platforms out there around jump testing, speed development, sports technology education. He's widely recognized for his ability to translate complex performance data and sports technology into systems that actually work for coaches and athletes on the ground. So, welcome to the show. And to get us started, because we have a lot to talk about here, this will, for me, I think the one that I would love to start with is the challenges in sports technology as a business. So, the question really is, sports technology has exploded from GPS to motion sensors to force platforms, timing systems, cloud platforms. But turning good technology into a sustainable business model is an entirely different challenge. And we've often spoken about this. And I think the confusion really is around having the best technology versus having the right technology and the growing pains.
Yes.
So to, kind of give us an idea, can you see where they often fail and what and integrating these tools? What are those growing pains that you've seen? And it kind of it's a cycle that would constantly happens. So with that, is it reality or is it hype?
Yeah, wow, that's a sharp question because there's a lot of considerations to factor in, which is, does the product work? Does the user really want it, or do they feel obligated now that, hey, you have to have technology, or does it look like you're doing your job? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it really delivering value, or is it just something that the technology is, if it's like, for example, if it's a measurement tool, is it observing a problem with a lot more detail, but doesn't really help you make a decision to fix the problem? And we see a huge amount of that. They just assume that if you're measuring, there's value to measurement. Now, there's always interest in measurement. Don't get me wrong. That's a great starting point. But what you're talking about now is the complexity of, hey, how many true sports technology companies are actually profitable? And you'd be very surprised. So I think the question is, can you deliver a company that's going to be not only growing, and sometimes there's investors, or are you going to be able to be sustainable over 5, 10 years? A good example is Ergotest. That company's been around before I started coaching in the early 90s, and they're still doing cutting edge things. Small company out there in Norway. Then you have huge companies. You're like, wow, that's amazing. But are they even solvent, really? Right? If they didn't have massive investments by huge brands, would they be able to keep the lights on? So there's an art and science to this of just being a sports technology company that's actually in business, which is, can you deliver a product that is going to create a lot of value, and do the users really like using it and find an actual extracted value? Meaning, hey, this is part of what I do. I don't do it because for optics, it helps me. Either it's a convenience, or is it delivering information, or it speeds up things. There's some sort of value connected to it. It's not just, do we collect data? There's a lot of great technologies that don't really extract information. So there's a lot of value to operations that are just more than data. The hardest thing
Can
that people, yeah, yes, what's the,
can you
so
expand on that? Because you kind of mentioned that some tools are not perfectly accurate. You've mentioned this in another podcast, but are they reliable and practical? And I think that's what you're implying here. And how do companies find that balance between scientific rigor and like the commercial usability? I think that's what you're trying to say.
yeah, there's The good news is that gap between consumer friendly and research grade is pretty much, if you do it right, it's there. In fact, there's a lot of interesting companies that just don't know better, and they're making research grade solutions, uh, but they're able to find a way to make it user friendly, affordable, and that's what you tend to see more in the IMU space. The assumption is like for example, you brought up motion analysis and computer vision. Well, hey, it's just a software company. That's not true. Computer vision companies are hardware and software, but usually like to focus on, hey, send us the video because the burden of capturing is painful. So
Yes.
they always like that idea, say, hey, investors, we're going to be a software company. We don't have to worry about, hardware or anything like that. We're just going to take the data and we're going to deliver the goods. A good example of that is Dartfish. They've been around for,
Yeah.
gosh, 2 decades. Now, they've always been seen as, okay, what software do I buy from Dartfish? But you still need to be a turnkey solution. You need hardware. And the first myth is like, well, we'll just use the iPhone and use the camera. There's a company called ViewMotion. Are they a software company? Yes. But to be a solution, you're going to need a camera. And anytime that you have a camera, you need someone behind it. So it's not really a human, it's view motion. It should be human motion because not only are you capturing the video as a human, but it's showing video data. So let's get back to non-data, and we'll also address the question you have, which is this a useful measuring tool? And there's a big difference between a proxy or, there's a validity. Does the test measure what it's supposed to measure?
Yeah.
We're having this nightmare with VO2 max right now because the longevity companies, everyone likes to have these sort of like concierge medicine. And so you do a VO2 max test.
Yep.
Well, a VO2 max test, you might have the best device, but is the protocol valid? Did they go all out or did they just stop because it got hard? So even a VO2 max requires a human element. So I always tell people if you're in the sports technology game, the first book that you buy should be Jurassic Park because that is going to be what's going to go on what you're doing. And then they laugh and they giggle.
It
But
is
then
a
I
good
say, okay,
concept.
it is. So let's get back to uh, delivering a value doesn't have to be data. For example, you take a flywheel, and that's creating a reliable load based upon kind of an interaction of the user. You might not be able to measure it, even if you have a measuring device. That is a technology, a simple one. I mean, it's the wheel, for God's sake. And there's a lot of understanding that people assume that if it's not measuring, it's valuable. Take force plates, for example. Force plates, if you're doing a counter movement jump on force plates, you have some sophisticated products out there. But you don't do vertical jumps on the force plates to get better at doing the vertical jump. You usually do plyometrics, you usually do some lifting, maybe you work on some skill work. But there's a big difference between that and maybe, like, for example, a motorized resistance device that is almost like acting as an LPT to get biofeedback of what the user's doing. And also it's adding a load to it. Isokinetics, 80 years it's been around. That's giving feedback and resistance at the same time. So
Yeah.
that those are some examples of like it becomes kind of gray of what you're delivering. You know?
No, I agree. And I think the experience is what you're describing, right? Um, we want to offset crashes, login issues, workflow annoyances to the athlete. And then the worst thing is this is an awesome demo, but this is also reinforcing some bad habits. And I've seen this with the counter movement jump as the example. So
Yeah,
it,
that's a good point. So what we have is uh, a lot of the baggage of technology where when measurement becomes a priority, there's there's a pollution of the experience. Could be workflow. You mentioned logging in, security, and tapping, and okay, we're still the human species. Just because we have technology that is recent doesn't mean that that's part of like our workflow. So, like, for example, 10 years ago, when CrossFit was a lot more popular, right? You'd go to a gym and it was like cavemen, literally paleo nutrition, people without shirts, no equipped chalk, right? And that was very tribal. Uh, Now people said, okay, that's low tech. I said, you know what?
It worked.
Maybe, yeah, it's not ideal for
Not for
everyone
me.
because it's
Yeah.
not personalized training. But with the strength of it though is, uh, it was the workflow was pretty easy. It's pretty robust. The power goes out as long as you have light and windows, you could get a workout. If there's no Wi-Fi and there's no power, a lot of these, you realize what's important. But back to what you said earlier, technique, for example, are you trying to get a better score or are you trying to get better at what you're doing? Best example is barbell training. Are people doing an upright row to try to get a better illusion that you have power and you're chasing a number, or are you trying to chase athletic development, which is, are you really trying to do the movement quality to get better? And then you just happen to get a measurement through embedded testing.
Yeah, I think, teams and gyms try to always focus on the ROI. So they're trying to look at this as, am I getting, you mentioned it, the value of the movement, but does the movement really give you the outcome that you're looking for? Or are we making a great weightlifter? Or are we making, so it's always, that's the rub. So you're hoping that the sports scientist or the strength coach has has learned along this way because the ecosystem has changed as well. So, and what I'm implying by this is that now this integrated disciplinary ecosystem, we've now have that individual that captures that data that we're kind of alluding to is a sports scientist. Doesn't have to be a strength and conditioning coach. Could be a tech guy mostly. And that's now in the environment. So we're seeing that kind of change, the data acquisitioning side, or a role is given to maybe an athletic trainer or to an assistant strength coach or to an assistant manager. So, it kind of goes back to what's the ROI for this? Is going beyond the marketing slides, and then it goes back to you know companies keeping it bringing it back to business. That the next thing that kind of I think we've always spoke about is it worth the dollar value in my budget over the next 3 to 5 years, because there's software to support, there is products that will break down, or items that I need to replace, like you brought up metabolic testing. Um, I'm going to have to get pieces and parts that are, or because of wear and tear and because of testing, I got to
Yeah.
replace.
Yeah.
So these are things that businesses and teams need to think about. So is it worth it? Is it worth it to have it? And
Well, if you want a list, I can give you things that people don't consider. Most people think about dollars and saying, okay, what's the cost of getting this to be consistent and sustainable? And what they do is they look at maybe a subscription cost or the upfront hardware cost. And then they start thinking a little bit more intelligently and say, okay, is there training involved? Do I have to give up time in order to get this information? Now, if you're doing this with one piece of technology, then when you do it for three, it gets a little trickier. Once you start doing this over 10 years, it becomes its own monster. And you start talking about roles. Oh, is the athletic trainer doing this, or the sports scientist? This is why performance analysis needs to be better in the US, because the role is not sports technologist. Maybe a title like that might be antiquated. Everyone has to use technology now. So now even that phrase that, might have been interesting in 2006, maybe I should update my LinkedIn bio. But I think it comes down to that everyone's digitally native now. And if
yep.
you are in the game, you probably had to evolve whether you're using, a Commodore 64 in college. So here's some things to think about. It's not just the dollars. or even time, or it's a lot of human capital, such as the emotional uh, energy that you have to bring into something. You have a line waiting, the Bluetooth is funky, and then everyone's let down. Oh, we don't have that information. Then there's a psychological effect. Hey, am I going to have a good season this year if I don't get baseline? Okay. Or someone's going to say, hey, can I trust this coach? Did he make the right decision on this purchase? Right. And then the coach is wondering, hey, like I got colleges aren't exactly cheap to send my kids through. I bought these three pieces of technology, and every single time I do a demo to my superior, it freezes or it spits out a random number generator. You've also said about metabolic testing. We remember during lockdown, masks, right? A lot of people like, hey, I don't want to put a mask on again.
Yeah.
Or, hey, I don't want to clean this because COVID isn't gone. And forget about COVID, the flu is just really pounding New York
Yes.
City right now. So I think that there is second order effects and marginal analysis that no one thinks about. The companies don't want to think about it because you're responsible. You got to
Yeah.
overcome that. So you made some great points, but there's some additional burdens to consider.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of leads me to my next question too, which is, you've talked about that there's a bubble, the people versus the tools.
Yeah.
You know, do we hire smarter practitioners or do we buy more tech? And I think you kind of given that answer a little bit right now, which was more about people first over tech second, because the performance program or how do we build on that? Do we build on the performance program or do we build on the product roadmap? And it's cart first or horse first. And I think often, to your point, you might get a piece of equipment, but that number is not the end all be all, and everyone wants it to be. And I feel like as a conditioning program or a strength program or even a personal training program, they need to understand that one, you definitely need to have the proper practitioner. Um, are we at a bubble now, though? And how are companies and organizations dealing with this? Because we're seeing a push towards AI, and we're seeing a push towards uh, these, taking all the structured data out there and putting it in a pool, a data lake. But what are we going to do with it? So how do we solve that? Is there a bubble? And what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, there's definitely an AI bubble. And it's not like it's going to cause a collapse like 2008, where, suddenly we're going to have a nightmare. I do think, I do think that you talked about the data lake, right? And the question is, who's drinking from it? When you look at who is making decisions, what information, if you weren't listening to the strength coach during analog years, you really think that like I can tell by a company whether the team coach uses it. I said, your team coach doesn't look at this. How do you know? Well, you don't have an export of CSV or PDF, so that's a hint. But a greater hint is that all the stuff that you have for reporting inside the platform, I can tell that there's no team coaches logging in. So my only concern is to say, okay, are you collecting data that's ornamental? It's great for PowerPoint slides at analytics conferences. This is the typical ruse or bubble. Someone comes into a national conference. Everyone in there is like, entrepreneurs, media people, and it's like a TED talk, right? Someone does a PowerPoint, and then even me, I'm in my late 40s. I'm like, I want to believe. And so you hear this wonderful presentation of, analytics and data driven and science and stuff like that. And then what you tend to see now is someone's a little bit more skeptical than they were 10 years ago. So
Yes.
what was happening at a major conference was someone made a bold claim. It sounded a little like a sales pitch. And then what happens is they check in, right? They go to social media and saying, okay, they're talking about, shipping blueberries in from Maine and organic meals for the athletes. And then at 2 a.m., someone's at Shake Shack, right? And they're doing the triple burger and shake combo. And it's like, wait a minute, you just talked about sleep profiling. This is right before the NBA finals, and this dude is wearing a Burger King crown. So what happened here of what is reality and what is truth? I'm more impressed about the person that's on there and saying, here, we're complaining, we're suffering, guys have jet lag, we're dealing with a rash of injuries because of specializations, or something. I just feel like that bubble is because people need the bubble to exist. Hey, let's say if you're not collecting massive amount of data, do you think the data science people want to hear like, yeah, we're not going to be measuring this stuff anymore? Well, that's a problem. They don't have a job. So I understand people's perspectives. I just think that we have to be a little bit more honest about what are the true problems that we're facing. How are we actually making a dent into it?
No, no, you're, kind of to wrap this all, that topic all up is I think companies underestimate the community, and then the community doesn't understand that, yes, we have a lot more technology, but we're still technically in our infancy for data acquisition, data collection. It's easier now. Like a lot of the new coaches have no clue at the early 2000s and 1990s of the nightmare of collecting data from a roster of 28 athletes, 29 athletes. It would be downloading data one by one, 2 to 3 hours. The calls that the screaming calls that I would get that you have experienced as well, and the gripe from startup companies. I think startup companies need to understand you can't underestimate that community. So when you go in there and then do your pitch, you should be aware that this community, one, it's small. Two, it is you can't add to their day. If you're going to add to their day and if you're going to collect data for data's sake and not at least give them trended information that has correlation or can be identified as a meaningful outcome, then they're going to do away with it. And I've seen many programs, Ohio State, Notre Dame, UConn, and eventually they boil it down to a couple of data points. You don't need tons of information. So I know that you have experienced the same. Um, can you give a little bit of what you think on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's humbling because you just talked about the 90s and you remember the infrared dongle,
Yeah.
right? And you're trying to get, like this is before Bluetooth. I mean, so but the issue is that like if you had to go, steampunk, what would you do and what things are timeless? Like for example, there's a company I briefly worked with that really cared about attendance, is how to make attendance easier. Um, that's a huge thing because at the end of the day, you know, you know, you have to prove that like what resources did you have, which is time and effort, and what did you do with it in a way that's productive and meaningful. So, I think the phrase key performance indicators. I had a colleague, just after 9/11, he came over and it was my assistant coach, and he was looking at my training and it was written through Excel. And he's like, you need key performance indicators. I don't know how to coach with you because I see a lot of workouts. And so key performance indicators in 2009, 2010, I wrote, and this was obviously based upon some of the work from Stephen Few, which was what is your key performance indicators? The problem with that, it became bastardized.
Yes.
Okay. So for me, the first thing I care about is attendance and attitude. Well, how do you measure attitude, right? If you tell someone to go, hey, I need to do 6 sets of two on snatches, for example, do they roll their eyes and mutter? Do they nod? Do they bang on their chest and they're like ready to go? That's not as easy to measure as bar path and bar speed. Now, bar speed is a proxy to say, okay, the load is an effort. Now, bar path might say, did you do it right? So there's a lot of details with that. So for me, those are the first things: attitude and effort. And of course, when you're looking at is, are they present and available? The second thing is pain. I'm a huge As I get older, I realize the errors of my ways when I was self-coaching myself or just experimenting. You pay a little price. Now, I'm not crippled by any means, but I have enough pain to say, you know what, there were some mistakes. When you're working with young athletes or even older athletes, there are pain drugs. There's adrenaline, and some of the mistakes you have might not show up for a decade. Okay,
Yes.
or you might not know that you made the mistakes because you might not see them again. So I think one of the things is that we don't really measure that pain experience really well, whether it's perceptual phantom pain from a chronic injury, or it's something where, okay, how do I know that you have soreness but not mechanical injury, right? So a lot of athletes that are young now don't really understand that process. And that's because a lot of the times information's coming from external means. Who's doing ratings of perceived exertion now? Because of the relationship issues with coaches and athletes being still an ever never ending problem, we don't really have that trust factor to get, okay, ratings of perceived exertion. So I love the sports psychology of reported experiences because I say, hey, you literally wrote this down and said this, but then your actions don't match it, right? So that allows people to say, okay, can we start on what you believe in, not just what I think is going to work? And that really helps. In my opinion, good data improves the relationship between you, the practitioner, and the athlete. Big brother, guardian angel. It just, do they like you, right? Oh, he's spying on me. Okay, you just don't like them, right? That's usually sometimes government or company type approaches or surveillance countries and stuff like that. But if you're doing something with good ethics in mind and you're doing there in your effort is to help them, it's like, hey, guardian angel, they got someone to help me. So my last couple points is really simple longevity metrics. And I say longevity is that anyone from the cradle to the grave should be looking at things like heart rate and HRV. Very simple. Activity, I'm a big fan of simple IMUs. And then video for me for activities is sort of like deep dive 3D. But
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of moving away from having a camera involved. For me, cameras better be long shots and they better be doing something more than just creating avatars or stick figures or skeletons that are running around on a laptop. And then the other ones that to me is the ABCD. You got activities, biochemistry, cardiology, and then distribution, which is sort of like body composition, bone, uh, uh, body metrics like height, weight, all that stuff. Simple things that you don't need to be doing a lot of high tech with. Uh, Simple things as, for example, height and leg length are wonderful multipliers to some very sophisticated technology. But if you don't know someone's height and weight, a lot of these metrics don't really have relative values. It's just, okay, we know they're running fast, but is it really good for a 15-year-old boy? You know? And then, of course, the biochemistry, we're seeing a bloodbath, literally. All these blood analysis companies are just
Yeah.
reselling Quest Diagnostics. Well, I got Life
Mhm.
Extension Foundation in 99. That's when like, whoa, I'm buying something from the internet. What are they doing? Now, yeah, the looks better on an iPhone. Okay, so we went from tablet, excuse me, went from an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, whatever the dimensions are. We barely use paper now, to an iPad. That's not really innovation. That's iteration. And everyone on, we're seeing all these roles of innovation. It's usually taking something that's been done in military in the 80s, and then now it has a shiny enclosure and Bluetooth to a smart device. There's been very little progress. So those are my key performance indicators. You know,
I
more
think
of a
those are some
rant.
really,
Sorry.
no, I think those are very good points because you talk about subjective and objective, and you
Yeah,
talk about basically creating a digital twin of
yeah.
the individual, right? An understanding of their mind body type of approach. So, let's move to the challenges of like motorized resistance. And this is something that, we've spoke about. And, I guess to kind of start it on that topic, the mechanical promise versus like a mechanical reality. You've talked about this with overspeed and specialized treadmills and sprinting,
Yeah.
where that motorized resistance really is adding value, or is it just an expensive distraction? So, what are some biomechanical and technical red flags that you've watched when athletes use overspeed or high tension motorized systems for strength training?
Well, let's look at assistance and resistance. Okay, that's a good starting point. Because when you're doing overspeed or assisted speed, that's a separate topic than motorized resistance. Uh, I like to just make it easier so we don't spend too much time on the running side. Although I love track and field, and I love swimming and speed skating and all the sports really. I also want to make sure it's clear that there's like things like tonal, which is recreation. Um, yeah, there's LeBron James endorsing it, but I think LeBron was probably pretty good before tonal was invented. So it's like it gets confusing because the market sees an elite athlete working with a technology or a product, and is that credibility or is that, oh, this is for pro athletes? No, obviously it's for everyone. So let's start with, I think the easiest thing to do is start off with analog, uh, motorized, uh, let's say motorized resistance. Okay. So we know as soon as a lot of the machines that would be doing plates or cable based, this is like over 100 years old. 100 years old. We're talking
Yeah.
1890s. Believe it or not, Providence, Rhode Island had a gymnastics training, and it wasn't like gymnastics as like like the horse and all like conventional like the sport of gymnastics. It'd be like gymnastic apparatus, and they'd show like what would look like a tonal without a flat screen, cable system, a resistance modality. Soon as you had a motor or electric components, you created a reliable way to create torque. Now, there's three things you can do with that. You can manipulate the velocity, the RPMs. Okay. You can increase the mechanical load, right? And there's also the measurement component, right? Outside of that, there hasn't been any progress. Now, there's been some interesting things. For example, years ago before lockdown, Boston Biomotion, which is now Proteus, had a very foreign magneto style resistance, which is using magnetic brakes. Okay. Well, that has been repurposed from some inventions years earlier. A lot of robotics were using those things.
Yeah.
And now those robotics are used to create, instead of assistance, resistance against it. So there's a company that has a robotic resistance for stroke people. So they have fixed, easy motions to replicate. Now, my concern right now is that you see a whole bunch of products. You see motor boosted, which is there's a flywheel company that's providing that, right? So you're doing the flywheel plus it adds eccentric overload beyond the rebound effect of the inertia,
Uh,
and that's a boost. Okay, so that's interesting. But then like stuff like beyond power has the Voltra, which is similar to like 1080 motion. And now we're starting to see the evolution. You have expensive isokinetics, medical testing and research, see it at hospitals. Definitely not the gym of a recreational person, right? Then it becomes a little bit more prosumer. Maybe elite sports teams start getting involved out of the range, except for maybe super luxury clients. Now you're getting the technology that an elite athlete could benefit from that's more portable, right? More, it's just consumer friendly, more workflow, more ergonomic. Bigger companies are getting involved in repurposing some of the stuff, whether it's for taking robotics and making it interesting for sports, or they're taking, like, for example, the scariest thing is probably fishing companies. That industry is using
Yes.
electric reels. So like a company like that has like an electric reel, that's scary because they're used to handling marlin or fishing boats like that, and now they have something for 1,200. Now you start connecting to an app, you start using it. Interestingly, that's disrupting things. Voltra is very disruptive because a lot of those products that were $20,000 and $30,000 now they need to compete with the same vendor in terms of what are you paying for? Torque per dollar per minute. It's durable. It provides really high reliable data. That's dangerous. So, but the problem is that is it delivering the goods? Is training with isokinetics going to make you the best, the next, Messi? No, right? So if it's only a type of resistance of a type of training, even if it's multi-joint versus single joint, the leap is saying it's not much better. There are some people that will always say, hey, I have like right now amazing technology that is motorized. I can't say this in front of people and saying, hey, little Johnny is in JV on the bench. If he trains for 8 weeks, he's going to get a scholarship from Indiana football, right? So that's an interesting thing is Miami, University of Miami versus Indiana, you're dealing with some interesting technology comparisons. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, there's still the coaching involved. Uh, so those are the things that from the motorized side. I think that the motorized stuff is valuable. There's measurements. There's different types of synthetic resistance that you can come up with. Isodynamic. Isokinetic is obviously, we're familiar with that because it's old. Isoinertial. And isotonic. There's ISO this, ISO that. There's tons. But I still coach with barbells because you got to learn how to grip something. It's amazing. Some people are using motorized resistance and they're in a machine and they're getting this effect. Then 10 minutes later, they're doing suitcase carries. And I'm like, well, if you simply walked out with a barbell, you might have gotten those steps. So it's like there's still a long ways to go with application.
Yeah, it's trying to shift from the marketing of a hero product into the reality of practical integration. I think at the end of the day, you can't measure it all. You want to identify what you want to measure consistently over a period of time. That gives you kind of this ecosystem that you've explained. You know, I think though, kind of really to really bring this together a little bit more, there's a history lesson here of the
Yeah.
older generation of sports technology that I think, we need to, I think kind of puts this together really well. Before, what do you do with the data, right? So before cloud dashboards and APIs, coaches, using technology like the gates, the force platforms, GPS technology, had to
Yeah.
pretty much do it yourself type of, it was really the do it yourself generation, if you really think about
That
it.
that
So,
that yeah, so that's a good point. And we don't talk about that. So I think timeline with sports tech is it's sort of like, and this is sort of like the first generation of Planet of the Apes, right? Remember the orangutans didn't want to talk about, man being before the apes, right? When that doll made the
yeah,
mama sound, Charleston Heston, I can't do an imitation anymore, but he's like, they were there before you. right? And it's hilarious because no one wants to talk about the technology that was before and how little has changed. From a timeline, and this gets back to overspeed. Overspeed started probably when someone's running, they're chased by the saber-toothed tiger, and then the wind came. That's the first generation, right? Organic, natural overspeed. Unfortunately, the overspeed, if you're getting chased by a mountain lion or a bear, they're both people are getting the benefit of it, right? Unless you're running with the wind, and then suddenly you got to get chased before you can jump into a cave. There's no advantage. After that, there was simple pulley systems, and the pulley systems used technology that the Romans had, which is how to leverage the pulley so that you can create a mechanical advantage to get towed. Now, it wasn't smooth, wasn't really reliable because you have some hardworking coach tugging or running with the device. Now, that was in the 80s, right? And in the same time in the 80s, the Finns, gotta love them, were using an industry technology, probably repurposed, and you just do it yourself. All those researchers, they were like MacGyver. Maybe half the people listening don't know who MacGyver was, but they were being resourceful and saying, how can I use this technology to create a towing effect? Now, there's a big difference between a towing based upon velocity and towing versus assistance versus load. You're unloading 1, 2, 3, all the way to maybe 4 kilos before you start disturbing things. Now, I was very clear 10 years ago when the motorized assistance and resistance technology started to get some traction. I said, is it overspeed, meaning more than humanly available you can do, or is it some assistance? Because you could go 90% effort and get a little bit of assistance, and now you're doing some high quality work without putting 100% of muscular contribution to it. So the overspeed versus assistance. Now, assistance is interesting because, how many people will do the 10% unloading with Alter G? But one of the things that's been very disappointing is most people are trying to walk from point A to point B. Now, on a treadmill, we're assuming that you unload vertically with having it propped up with Alter G. You're unloading mechanically vertically. But when you're getting assisted, you could do a couple kilos, right, for a person that had a stroke or an athlete that had an injury and you're trying to give them a little assistance on the injured leg so they can maintain rhythm and start programming confidence into their brains, because that's the target organ. I think that we really missed the window of assistance, and the new technologies that are there, we're not going to see the big players being relevant in hospitals and clinics, because you got to bill for it or you got to code for it. And if you don't do those two, it doesn't count. And whether you're in Canada or the US, you could cross the border from Buffalo, it's still going to be the same challenge, which is, how do I get credit for assisting someone? Now, I like assisting because you create a measurement component. You can combine it with technology. The future is going to be something small and nimble to create that assistance. All you need is a little bit of help. So that's where things are going. And it started with, like I mentioned, swimming was probably doing the best assistance because coaches needed that. And they've been doing it for 50 years, where they're doing really finite, high-end, high-caliber technology to do either assistance to get people to be swimming faster and get comfortable with those positions and the timing, or they're just using it to create a learning experience of like, okay, drag. So that's where the timeline is, and that came from not only in the 70s, but they did this in the 60s. Really interesting stuff.
And the thing is, it's I feel like a lot of this generation now hasn't learned. They've kind of adopted or benefited from some of the changes, but there is benefit to knowing what has happened in the past, because sometimes you don't need to recreate the wheel. I just look at, taking proprietary hardware, towards a commodity of sensors that, we can do better with software in some cases. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. But the long term really is, how do we support it? How do we empower it? And I think we're starting to see more of that, especially on the wearable side and how it's changing the game. And if we look at it, it's moved from basic wrist devices, chest straps, smart apparel, patches, rings, and
Rings,
it's
yeah.
like after our first wave of all this technology. I mean, I remember smart clothing is not new. I mean, I've seen it in the 80s. I've seen it with athletes, everyday health. Kind of becoming now a cheaper option and more widespread and predicting really it, these embedded training environments. So from the devices and ecosystems, you've spoken about this, like accelerometers and small sensors will replace many traditional plates and pads, and how has that prediction played out? And what does the current landscape look like now in 2026?
2026 is going to be, the pendulum will swing to a little bit more. You're going to have the AI hype, and everyone's going to wonder, hey, was this email you? Or, I'm starting to always, I'm being very cautious right now on any work that's been sent to me. I talked to a Brown professor. As you know, there was the shooting, but way before that, there was a time where I was talking to a professor, and they're talking about um, doing an oral presentation,
Yeah,
because with some of these language models, you're seeing some pretty good
yeah,
presentations, but you can tell that it's missing that little piece. And so, do they use Grammarly or do they plagiarize? I mean, that's a very simple question. Um, so for me, I think the future is going to be leaner, because one of the things is, how much time are you spending collecting data and how much time loss of training? Oh, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. Okay, so then why are you creating lines and doing lectures, right? You're lecturing how to log in and do this, and you're teaching. Best example is, look at barbell tracking. If you do a barbell jump, it's not the same as a counter movement jump on a really good force plate. But I don't have a force plate and I don't lift on my force plate every weight stack. So if you're a high school, you don't have 16 sets of force plates. You
yeah.
might have 16 barbell tracking devices. And if you can get a reliable output, you can tell if someone's sick, dying, dead. Whether they're fresh, right? Whether that they're exhausted, whether they have discomfort. So I think what we're going to see is a little bit more resourcefulness, because I think people just have a little bit of tech fatigue. There's been a little bit of sports science and tech fatigue over the last few years. It's not an epidemic, but it's enough for someone to say, hey, like, let's slow down before I adopt this. And a lot of people are trying to prune tech right now because they said, hey, you guys promised me that this thing's going to change. Look at the injury list for the last 5 years. Show me in baseball
It hasn't.
how the elbow is being better served. What they'll say is like, hey, it's the guys over there with the junior groups. It's not us. There's nothing we can do. They're already hurt, which is true. Kids are getting Tommy John's surgeries earlier. So I think the main thing is, I don't believe that we're going to see any changes, but we're not going to see a spike in growth. There's going to be a little bit of a resolution, and we're also going to see more creativity. Hey, we're going to use technology, we're going to embed it more, and we're just going to make the user experience for both the coach or the staff and the athlete better. So you're not that you're drowning in data, you're being annoyed and tugged on. It becomes more of a mosquito of technology. We're just like, oh, get away from me. So I think we're going to see a consolidation, and it's going to be good. You're going to see more people say, hey, you better deliver the goods or we don't use any of it, regardless of what space it is. Doesn't matter. Like, for example, are we writing better workouts than we did 20 years ago? When I look at workouts, I'm like, what happened to all the science? You got all these conferences, you got ebooks, you got online
And
master classes, and I don't see better design. I see, hey, a lot of stuff
dogma,
from social media, you know?
a lot of dogma, a lot of they're all following exactly. They're following the thought leader, and because you got the evidence based and then you got the practical based, and that was always the argument, right?
Yeah.
There's many examples of it. Buddy Morris, who everyone criticized him, but everyone realized that you don't have to always lift to create a great athlete. As opposed to, and then you've got even got the Michael Boyles, who, everyone, criticizes him for single-legged work, but look at everyone. So are people creatively understanding the science of it, or are people copying and pasting? And I feel like you got a little bit of everything, but then if you're talking about AI, people are chat GPTing workouts. People are dumping data into a large learning model and saying, use these sources and craft me this. But to your point, do they understand? It might be it might be somewhat arranged correctly, but do they understand why it works? What is it about?
And didn't
Um,
work.
and yes, did it work?
Didn't work because just because they scrape the internet does that
Did
right? I'm saying a lot of the stuff is like, and I had this where I had a tech person that defected from a athlete management system, and he said, "Oh, like coach, there won't be any coaching in 3 or 4 years, right?" This is the saying, "Oh, they're going to do surgeries with robots and stuff like that." So the problem is we don't know and understand human intelligence. So if you're trying to scale something you don't know or automate, there's limitations, right? So even if it doesn't work to begin with, making it more scaled and faster doesn't help. So like what you said is like you have methodology, you got a guy like Buddy Morris, right? He's not a fan of Olympic lifting, right? He didn't need it. Okay, that's fine. You have Mike Boyle, did a lot of Olympic lifting, and he left and migrated from back squats to front squats to single leg activities. That's fine. And that does work for him. The question is, does it need to be done by anyone? Now, how does an LLM look and saying, okay, you have 5 different opinions that are much conflicting? Do they just average everything out and say, here's the common denominators, do this? Well, that's the flaw of averages, right? There are things, once you remove certain things, the ingredients and then the recipe changes. So, for example, there's a lot of people that believe that single leg lifts or activities should be done on the field or on the track. So, in the weight room, they might say, oh, it looks like they're doing bilateral training only. Well, if you're sprinting and doing plyos, you're clearly doing single leg activities. Now, single leg strength training, you might have someone says, hey, we use medicine balls and weight vest, and we do walking lunges on the track. Well, that's single leg. Might not be a primary lift, but this is the gray area that the nuances that you can only get from craftsmanship. I talked to a really, really good strength coach from the UK. His name is William Wayland, and he is going all in on craftsmanship because all those nuances that might be in the mind of a master artist might not be written down on the internet. A lot of good practitioners don't write, don't publish research. They just work and then they retire. And it's been like a burning of Alexandria in terms of that intellectual knowledge. So I think we're getting back to it. I think we're going to get back to the classics. Analog, a lot more moleskins and just writing things down. For me, I've gone more analog, and so I'm more polarizing. Really high tech, and then I stop at a certain point, and then I remove all tech entirely to get a little bit more organic, and that's been helping. So a combined hybrid approach is what I believe in.
Yeah, it's kind of that friction that tech brings,
Yeah,
or the annoyance that you kind of
yeah,
talked about as well. You know, because we want to, at the end of the day, we want to minimize this, right? We
Yeah.
want to be able to minimize the disruption, but then also take all this data that we're getting and the convergence of it, and now that we can gather it easier, and we can get these lab markers, but you're having a community of coaches, medical staff, and different practitioners that and the athlete that are now doing these things, and even general population that are basically using these insights, pun intended, bio insights, really,
Yeah.
to kind of create this intersection that we just kind of talked about. And I feel like there's so much here to peel back. There's so many more questions that we can talk about and elaborate. But I think these four topics that we kind of
Yeah.
reviewed really kind of give people, hopefully, give people more of a question to ask. You know, um, you know, you you know, you showed that sports technology is not just a story of new gadgets. It's really like about the people, about the system, and then the hard lessons of the past,
Yeah.
and really presenting the right tools at the right time. So from like a business reality and building sustainable products to nuanced, motorized resistance or assistance solutions, the history of early tech cycles, and finally the new era of like wearable technology. The one thing that we kind of really didn't talk about was kind of smart apparel, but I think it's a pattern that is emerging, that could work and help with coaching, could contextualize the athletic experience and create more of a data-driven gym or team or health um, operator look ahead that they can say, hey, this collects it. So the insight really offers a roadmap. And I think with the right tools and asking better questions, I hope people have listened to the questions that we were kind of talking about, and making sure that the tech amplifies rather than replace the great coaching.
Well,
So,
I think to finish off this conversation, we look at wearables. Start with the original wearable, which is clothes and good apparel. The issue is that usually technology starts with some sort of sensor and measurement, and then the last 10% they figure, oh yeah, we got to put it on the body. Now there's a big difference between like maybe a patch to get continuous lactate, right? Or when that's another company, Super Sapiens, those continuous glucose, and you know, and that's another example where it's hard to be sustainable. Uh, the apparel side, if you don't make good apparel, you're not going to really have a great sports technology company if it's a wearable. If you're wearing it, that's why people go to the wrist and to the finger. We've already kind of nailed the watch. We already kind of nailed the ring. The issue is the clothing. You know, you remember, I think it was Numetrics that was working with Adidas,
yes.
20 years ago.
Yep.
Well, we can't make a good heart rate strap. So what you're seeing in the industry, and this is tragic because cardiac information, cardiology matters. And so the couple companies that have really put some effort, obviously Catapult with their that smart shirt that they have, that the hardware is enabled to extract information from the heart, as well as being a thoracic location for estimations of work and basic player tracking from GPS and LPS. But my biggest concern is that heart rate used to be all the rage. It was heart rate lactate, 90s. That was kind of like the triathlon space really got some good traction. But what happened is as technology became cheaper, heart rate was like an afterthought. That's easy, right? And then it became become motion data or loading data.
Well, the
But guess
challenge too with heart rate too, just to add to that,
yeah,
and is to make it more accurate, you needed to do metabolic testing. So you needed to do lactate or some type of gas testing. And that community was challenged with using accelerometers, force platforms, and just simple chest belts. to ask them to do the metabolic testing, they would, that kind of, they acknowledged that you needed an exercise physiologist or some type of practitioner that
Yeah,
was
for
a
trim.
technician for that.
Yeah, even shrimp.
Yeah.
If you look at getting a training impulse, the issue is that there's a lactate calibration, right? But near infrared is now kind of disrupting that. There's a company
Yes.
called BioLink, right? They have a patch. There's another company called gosh, I forget. It's another patch company in Europe, right? And so I reached out to them. I said, hey, do you have any validation? And I said, hey, I'd like to talk about that. I only asked that after they canceled twice when I sent out questions to say, okay, is there internal validation, right? How do I know that this information is, because if a company that's been raising $100 million in San Diego hasn't come to market, how do I trust a company that might be around for a year or so, right? And it's not that these companies, are fudging the information or they have bad products. They're not even available, so I can't judge that. But when you talk about lactate, okay, the first thing you think about is a blood draw, right? Martin, the sports scientist, I don't know if he's still with PSG, wrote a wonderful "Is it worth the prick?" right, to get lactate, and he showed a good argument for workload and heart rate being enough to say, okay, it might not change your decision making. Now, I do believe that lactate, because uh, I did saliva, I've done blood, and I've done some other patches over the last two Olympics. That will help create a little bit more precision to heart rate, because there's the emotional component. I give the example of being on a roller coaster. Maybe you're not doing any type of work and you're just sitting there, and you're going to get a lot of responses to your heart rate, right? It's going to elevate, even though that the output and strain that you're putting in isn't really there. So lactate isn't, even though there's associations with heart rate, there's still different markers, right? You can be lying down and have sepsis, and that lactate meter is going to be through the roof. So I think that with biological markers, and we talked briefly about with blood and chronic, well, this is an acute response. And I think what's my concern is continuous lactate is going to be like continuous glucose, where it's like, wow,
Yeah.
I'm getting my dopamine hit by looking at my glucose levels after I went to like get pancakes at that restaurant in Tokyo, right? I got this fancy pancakes really did a number on me, but I don't really think that that's exciting for people. That's sustainable. So I think the lactate market's going to be really competitive for different reasons besides the modality of capturing the data. So, modeling it, what's the response? That's why calculations and algorithms are underappreciated. You don't have to always measure something. You're just going to have a estimate that is a reliable error to say, hey, I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, this person's really, really tired and weak. Or this person's really doing well, keep going. That's how coaches respond. So back to the apparel side, because we've been talking about almost medical products, we will see, and what's going to happen is all the GPS companies that kind of scoffed at heart rate, that say, you know what, we're going to double down on making these lease style agreements and a race to the bottom, they won't be around anymore, because they made the classic blunder that other companies make, which is cheaper. Okay.
Yeah.
If you don't have margins, how are you going to make money? So a lot of
And not
times
only,
it's crazy,
and, and with the apparel, the biggest challenge, because I've attempted it twice in my
Yeah.
career, is the skews in body sizes. You got athletes that are just, their body sizes are so different. Huge shoulders, really small waist. Or you got the linemen that are just like big cinder blocks.
Oh,
So it's like how can I outfit everyone and be able to maximize apparel in an effective way. And you never make everyone happy. I tried. It was a nightmare to juggle 16 SKUs. It was just you gave up at one point. Because to your point, it's like you manufacture it, you source it, you try to figure out the margin dollars, which this is the business side of it that most coaches or consumers or athletes never take into account. And it's like the whole business, to your point, is most companies are not profitable. And the reason why they're not profitable is I almost feel like to get an investor, you need to show the potential. You don't need to show the profit. It's sad to say, but they don't want to see it half the time. But now that's kind of pivoted because there's been a history of so many companies that have raised so much money, but they've been utter, it's the best way to describe it. They've been a bust. It's
Yeah.
been a loss of lots of money.
And then the pivots are always sad because it's like, okay, we went after, Kevin Durant, but now we're going after Grandpa. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. You just can't go, there's the quadrants, right? You got military. Okay, we need a bailout. Let's make it for soldiers. And so they make it's made for everyone, but no one wants it because there's no clear commitment to the space. So when you go after the top elite athletes, the biggest con job is to say, okay, we have all these logos of pro teams, and then the pro teams are using, hey, the logos of the sports tech to say we're doing something great, and they could be blowing up athletes with injuries and all these problems. Doesn't matter. It's an illusion. So the real market's probably going to be the average person, and that's going to be recreational level.
Yep.
Or a high school athlete that just wants to have his or her senior year be successful, right? I want to go out. I'm not going to play football in college. I just want to make a play for the Thanksgiving game. So what I think is going to happen is, here's the crystal ball. We're finishing off with a bang. Okay? I predicted that because I'm making my own magic here. The number one thing is apparel is going to rule the roost. Because at the end of the day, companies like Adidas tried it, and they know that it's not worth it to be profitable. But from a brand move, someone's going to get it. We're going to see some of these micro brands, right? Sort of like micro beers. Someone's going to say, hey, like right now in ice hockey, I'm enamored with all the interesting armor to protect them from lacerations, right? Now, if those brands wake up and saying, hey, ice hockey isn't a really big space because it's not terrestrial like soccer, football, lacrosse, what do we need to do to work with some of these partnered companies like in the near space? Moxie Monitor, Train Red, and now we've seen Human went out of business, right? Knox is closing. Near infrared is very useful, but really on the research and monitoring space. When the apparel companies are able to be creative enough to merge that, and then the micronization occurs with NIRS, that's going to change the game. Huddle just had a partnership with Moxie Monitor. No one really saw the manifestation of how dangerous Huddle is now.
Yeah.
Huddle, good stuff on the video. I like what they're doing. But now what we're going to see is not just Sony Sport with Stat Sport and GPS. We're going to see sort of like these unholy alliances. And then we're going to see as an explosion of microbreweries. So you heard this here. Apparel. Start with the soft goods first. Are you a brand? That's just, I'm telling all companies. Hardware, software, I don't care. Biologics, I don't care. Start with the brand. And if you're doing a wearable, you have to really get good, talented people on design and fashion. And because that's the opportunity. The most expensive real estate is what you wear.
Branding is everything.
So the last thing to consider is that body area network. It's not going to be, hey, the athlete management systems where all the data feeds are going to go to central. It's going to happen where the athlete, it's going to organize, and you're going to see brands and you see this with Catapult, right? They're picking up a couple of acquisitions. No one's going to be able to say that the Perch acquisition is going to change the dynamics of Warren Buffett's portfolio, right? But you have to do those things. If you don't grow, you die. So those are the predictions: is the apparel side, micronization, and then we're going to have a user experience breakthrough. And that's something I can't get into because of a non-disclose. So I hope that was helpful, Marcelo. I found that your questions were very good.
Thank you. Well, if people want to find out more and get in touch with you, where can they go?
The best thing to do is X is still spikes only, and usually that's you're going to see opinions, and you're going to see a lot of good research being shared. LinkedIn is where I post some commentary on what's going on, and a lot of it is just honest feedback. Where if you're a company, don't make these mistakes, because there's a lot of great companies that have come and gone. I loved Zio, 12 years ago. Brainwaves, that's great. They're gone, right? So there's a
Yeah.
lot of good companies that have good products that have a lot of runway, and they don't make it. Look at Athos,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
EMG. Look at
Yeah.
Strive, EMG. I believe that EMG is going to be high definition. It's going to be more stable so that you can wash it 55 times and not degrade the sensors. Watch EMG is going to get a third round, probably this year.
Well, I also think that definitely there's so much more that you could, because the technology is getting smaller, battery sources are getting better, sampling rates are improving. So all the things from the biomedical engineering side are expanding finally. The challenge will be in a couple of things. Funding has always been the biggest problem for these projects. When these companies have given thought to it, they've never raised enough. They always think that they haven't. And that's been the other biggest challenge. That's why you're seeing some of the companies that have been out of business. Merger and acquisition is probably the biggest thing that I would add to this, and that that would be the advancement of everything else, but the merger and acquisition part is going to be very interesting, and we're seeing that just the tip of that right now.
You'll
So,
probably see that with, you're going to see a lot of mergers because sometimes the synergy between the products can create an opportunity for one of the companies or brands. Be Secure, which is a algorithm for cardiac data, that is really enticing. Um, but the question you have to ask is like, okay, do you build or buy? And so that's up to the companies that you have to do your due diligence. They have to really, a lot of times is it buying customer lists? Is it buying attention? So it just comes down to, what their unique needs are. But Marcelo, again, thank you for your time on
oh,
this. This has been a great conversation.
I enjoyed it. It's been a long time overdue. So,
Okay.
if anyone else wants to listen to or wants to have any specific questions, leave it in the comments. I'll make sure Carl and myself get back to you. Thank you again, Carl.
All right. Thank you.